The transport shuttle touched down on the barren training moon Orvellis 3 with a heavy metallic groan, its landing skids sinking slightly into the cracked soil. Dust rolled across the plateau in dull waves as the hatch opened, letting a sharp, dry wind rush through the cabin. Ethan Ward stepped out and narrowed his eyes at the endless expanse of pale earth stretching in all directions. Most cadets reacted with frustration or disbelief, but Ethan simply took a long breath, letting the scent of mineral dust settle into his lungs. He had seen much harsher landscapes on Earth, and something about the emptiness here felt strangely familiar. He tightened the straps of his pack and walked down the ramp without hesitation. Around him, alien cadets from 5 different species clustered in confused circles, each group whispering about what the instructors had said before the landing. The survival exam would last 5 days. No advanced tools, no shelters, no artificial heating. Each group would receive one basic object from the Academy's supply depot. The moment the command officer arrived, the atmosphere thickened as all cadets expected crates of gear, auxiliary kits, or at least emergency packs. Instead, the officer placed one simple object on the ground in front of them all. A standard-issue shovel with a wooden handle and a dull metal blade. A murmur of outrage rose immediately. Several alien cadets demanded clarification, insisting that one shovel couldn't possibly support a full squad's survival. A tall, 6-limbed Iveran stomped his feet in disbelief, complaining that his species required twice as much shelter space as humans. A scaled Vokari female hissed quietly, arguing that the instructors must be testing emotional stability rather than practical skills. Ethan listened silently while observing the soil texture beneath his boots. The ground looked deceptively solid, but the surface crumbled easily under slight pressure. He knelt, ran a handful of dirt through his fingers, and saw how the grains broke into finer particles the moment he crushed them. Perfect for shaping. Perfect for digging deeper layers, perfect for creating something useful. When the murmurs grew louder, the instructor merely crossed his arms and stared sternly at the crowd. He didn't explain the rules again. He didn't reassure anyone. He simply said that the countdown had begun and that each squad should move out and establish a functioning camp before nightfall. His tone made it clear that complaints would not change anything. The aliens continued arguing about fairness, but Ethan picked up the shovel without waiting for permission. He tested the weight, shifted the balance in his palm, and felt an immediate sense of purpose settle into his mind. He had grown up around woods and hills, where he used to dig fire pits with his father during camping trips. Tools were only as useful as the person using them. His squad followed him reluctantly. Some members still insisted the instructors must have hidden extra supplies nearby, but Ethan didn't waste time entertaining theories. The sun of Orvellis 3 was already dipping toward the jagged horizon, and the temperatures dropped brutally fast at night, according to the orientation briefing. If the squad wanted to make it through the first cycle, they needed heat and wind protection. Ethan walked to a slightly elevated ridge and tapped the ground with the shovel blade. The sound was hollow, which meant the soil beneath had trapped pockets of air. That made digging easier, but also suggested that surface winds here had shaped the terrain for centuries. He examined the slope angle and traced imaginary lines in the dirt, mapping airflow patterns in his mind. The aliens stared at him with confusion, unsure why he was drawing circles and lines using the tip of the shovel, but Ethan didn't bother explaining. Explanations could come later, when the camp no longer faced immediate danger. He started digging with fluid, practiced motions. The first shallow cut revealed darker, cooler soil beneath the bleached surface. This alone was promising. He expanded the hole, shaping it into a wide, circular depression that dipped gradually toward the center. As he worked, he adjusted his stance to respond to the moon's weaker gravity, which made each movement slightly exaggerated. He compensated for it quickly. Soon the outline of a fire pit formed, deep enough to shield flames from wind gusts, but wide enough to allow enough airflow for combustion. The alien cadets watched him in silence, unsure what he was trying to achieve. Some of them whispered that the shovel was useless. Others argued that Ethan's approach was too primitive for Orvellis III's harsh climate, but none of them stepped forward to help him, partly because the single shovel seemed too symbolic, as if touching it without confidence would reveal their uncertainty. Ethan continued anyway. Once the pit reached an optimal depth, he dug thin channels leading inward from 3 sides, each channel angled slightly upward, allowing wind to funnel oxygen into the center without neutralizing the protective walls. He used his boot to smooth the rim and packed the soil tightly to prevent collapse. When he finished, he stood back and evaluated the structure like a carpenter inspecting the frame of a new home. The aliens finally gathered closer, staring at the strange design that made no immediate sense. To them, the pit looked chaotic, asymmetrical, and pointless. One Vocari male asked why Ethan had wasted so much time digging something so insignificant. Ethan didn't respond with words. Instead, he reached into his pack and removed a handful of dried tinder provided during the drop. He placed it in the center of the pit, arranged a few dry sticks he had collected during the walk, and struck a spark using the rough stone he had picked up earlier. The flame ignited immediately. The fire didn't sputter or fight the wind. Instead, it burned with a steady, controlled glow as the hidden air channels fed it from below. A small plume of warm light illuminated the aliens' bewildered faces. Ethan crouched down, adjusting a fallen stick to improve combustion. The pit performed exactly as he expected. The walls trapped heat, the channels breathed air, and the shape redirected smoke upward in a thin spiral rather than sideways, where it would have been scattered instantly by the winds. For the first time since landing, the squad felt a sense of stability. One simple fire, one shovel, one human who clearly saw possibilities none of them had considered. As the sun continued dropping, the fire pit grew warmer, and the shock in his squad's eyes shifted into something close to admiration. Ethan sat on the edge of the pit and let the warmth wash over his hands. He didn't gloat, didn't lecture, and didn't comment on the others' earlier panic. He simply rested, listening to the crackle of the fire, knowing that this was only the beginning. The real work, shelter, trenches, storage, and everything else he could shape from Orvellis III's soil, would come next. But as night approached, the squad finally understood something fundamental. With only one shovel, Ethan had already changed their odds of survival, and he had barely begun. The fire pit glowed steadily long after the sun slipped beneath the jagged horizon of Orvellis III, but Ethan didn't stay seated for long. As soon as the fire stabilized and the squad felt a sense of temporary comfort, he stood up and scanned the terrain around their camp. The sky had turned a pale violet, and the first sharp gusts of cold wind brushed across the plateau. He felt the temperature falling quickly, much faster than the briefing had suggested. The dirt here carried heat poorly, which meant anyone relying on surface warmth alone would freeze before dawn. The fire pit was only step one. If the squad wanted to cook, stay warm, and survive the coming night, he needed to expand the work before darkness fully settled. Some alien cadets remained seated around the fire, absorbing the heat with wide, stunned eyes. Others wandered aimlessly, still unsure what to contribute. Ethan didn't wait for instructions from anyone else. He walked to a patch of slightly darker soil several meters from the pit and stomped lightly on it. The ground compacted differently here, producing a duller sound that hinted at moisture trapped deeper below. Moisture meant insulation and stability. If he dug in the right places, he could shape the landscape to serve as both a windbreak and a cooking workspace. He drove the shovel blade into the dirt. The soil resisted a little more than before, but he welcomed the challenge. The resistance meant structural integrity, something he could carve into walls without collapse. He began by creating a shallow trench that curved gently around the fire pit's perimeter on one side. Each movement of the shovel was deliberate. He adjusted the angle of every cut to help redirect wind away from the flames. Once the trench reached a sufficient depth, he expanded it outward and shaped a smooth incline leading down into it. The incline served as a controlled entry, but more importantly, it allowed cold air descending the slope to settle into the trench rather than reaching the fire. He worked quickly, fueled by instinct and a quiet sense of purpose. He didn't need to explain the physics behind each stroke. His hands already understood what the soil needed to become. The aliens gradually approached, drawn by the sound of repeated digging. A Volcari cadet watched in confusion as Ethan used his boot to compress the trench walls into firm, curved channels. She asked him why he was digging another hole when the first one already held a fire. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed subtly to the shifting wind patterns overhead. Because of the moon's atmospheric instability, the gusts now slanted sharply from the ridge toward the fire pit. Without intervention, the flame would flicker wildly and lose its stability. He tapped the trench rim lightly with the shovel, letting the Volcari cadet observe how the airflow dipped into the newly carved depression. She finally nodded, realizing that the trench effectively trapped the incoming gusts and prevented them from striking the fire directly. Satisfied, Ethan continued. He shaped small pockets within the trench, forming miniature basins that would hold hot stones later. Once the stones heated in the fire, he could transfer them into these compartments to create low, steady warmth for cooking. It wasn't a full stove yet, but it was a foundation. The squad watched him, slowly appreciating how much could be accomplished with nothing more than dirt and a shovel when the user actually understood terrain behavior. Ethan didn't rush his work. He moved with a steady rhythm, adjusting his grip on the handle to preserve stamina over long sessions of digging. Every few minutes, he paused to assess the shadows on the ground, identifying where the next cut would produce the best airflow redirect. Soon, the trench curved almost halfway around the fire pit, forming a natural barrier that protected the flames from sudden gusts. The aliens approached the depression and tested the temperature by placing their hands over it. A gentle wave of warm air rolled upward from the fire pit, guided by the trench walls and escaping through the angled openings Ethan had carved. The warmth remained steady even as the winds strengthened, proving that Ethan's design functioned exactly as intended. Now that he had stabilized the airflow, he shifted his focus to cooking. The squad had been issued a small ration pack for the first day, but the alien cadets had assumed they would simply warm the food over an open flame. Ethan knew that approach would waste heat and likely burn the thin caloric bars the Academy provided. Instead, he dug a narrow slot into the wall of the trench, carving a shallow shelf just above the warm airflow, but well below the flame's reach. He smoothed the shelf with the back of the shovel and tested its heat. It warmed quickly, but not enough to scorch food. Perfect for slow cooking. He returned to the fire pit, gathered several stones from the surrounding terrain, and placed them directly into the fire. Once heated, these stones would provide additional radiant energy for cooking in the trench without forcing the squad to hold the food directly above the flames. As he worked, one alien cadet questioned how he expected the stones to avoid cracking under sudden heat changes. Ethan didn't waste time arguing. He simply selected stones with fine, dense grain, stones less likely to shatter, and continued his routine silently. When the fire began glowing a deeper orange, he retrieved the stones using a long stick and placed them into the compartments he had shaped earlier. The trench warmed even more evenly now, creating a perfect cooking environment. The squad watched in awe as he placed the ration bars onto the shelf. The bars slowly softened and released a faint, savory aroma completely different from their usual chemical smell. The aliens leaned closer, fascinated by the transformation. The bars normally tasted dry and bland when eaten cold or poorly heated, but now they warmed evenly without burning. Ethan removed the first piece and handed it to the nearest cadet. Her eyes widened at the improved flavor, and she immediately called others to try the same. Ethan allowed himself a small smile as he watched their excitement. Food wasn't just nourishment here, it was morale, and morale could determine whether the squad worked together or fractured under pressure. But Ethan didn't linger on the success. He stepped away from the trench, walked toward the outer edge of the plateau, and knelt to test another patch of soil. The night wind sharpened, carrying cold air that bit at his face, but he didn't flinch. He needed to determine whether the remaining terrain could support further expansions, possibly a deeper pit for storing supplies or a windshield corridor leading into a protected space. He pushed the shovel into the ground again, feeling the gradual shift in grain density. Harder layers suggested the possibility of shaping platforms. Softer layers suggested insulation potential. He cataloged all of it in his mind, already envisioning what else he could build. Behind him, the squad continued eating the warmed food, unaware of how much planning he had already begun for the coming day. The fire glowed steadily, protected by the trench. The warmed stones created pockets of comfort. The shelf allowed efficient cooking without wasting fuel. The entire system worked in harmony, born from nothing but soil and a single tool. Ethan stood quietly, watching the firelight flicker across the alien faces. Even without asking, he could see that the squad now understood a simple truth. With knowledge and intention, one shovel could be more powerful than any advanced gear the Academy had refused to give them. The first miracle of dirt had begun, and Ethan was only getting started. The first light of Orvellis 3's morning arrived, not with a sunrise, but with a gradual thinning of the violet night sky, revealing long ribbons of pale gold that stretched across the horizon. Ethan had slept lightly, waking several times to check the fire and to listen for any change in the wind. By the time the camp began stirring, he was already walking the perimeter of the plateau, examining how the night frost had settled into the soil. Frost always revealed the truth of a landscape. It marked the low points where water pooled, outlined subtle drops in elevation, and exposed the paths where cold air moved fastest. He crouched near the ridge and touched the thin, icy layer with his fingertips. It cracked softly, breaking into tiny shards that glittered in the early light. A Vokari cadet approached him with a cautious expression, unsure whether she should interrupt. She asked him why he was studying frost instead of eating breakfast. Ethan didn't look up immediately. He followed the faint frost lines that curved away from the ridge and dipped toward the point where the camp had set up the fire. When he finally raised his head, he pointed along the natural channels etched into the ground. The frost revealed how the cold air traveled, and cold air meant water when the storms came. Orvellis 3 was infamous for sudden temperature swings, and the instructor briefing had warned them about nighttime storms that carried both freezing rain and abrasive dust. If the squad wasn't prepared, the camp would drown, freeze, or both. Ethan didn't want to waste a single hour. He returned to the center of the plateau and picked up the shovel. The aliens gathered around him instantly, though some kept a respectful distance after seeing what he accomplished the previous day. Ethan didn't give a speech. He never liked speeches. Instead, he pressed the shovel into the soil and began carving a deep line that followed one of the frost paths he had tracked earlier. The ground was stiff from the night cold, and every thrust required more force than usual, but he persisted with a steady rhythm that warmed his muscles and quickened his breath. The first trench took shape slowly, cutting a deliberate path away from the camp and extending far enough to direct incoming water beyond the main circle where the squad slept. Once the trench reached a safe distance, he widened it and tested the soil's behavior. Some layers crumbled instantly, while deeper layers clumped together in heavier segments. Those clumps were crucial. He used them to reinforce the outer wall of the trench by stacking and pressing them together like primitive clay bricks. A Yveran cadet finally stepped forward and asked whether the reinforced wall was necessary. Ethan explained that water didn't just arrive, it carved its way through whatever stood in front of it. If they left the trench loose, water could breach the walls and collapse portions of the camp. By shaping compacted soil into firm support structures, he could ensure the trench redirected water instead of becoming a channel for destruction. As the sun climbed higher, the frost melted into moisture, softening the upper layers of the ground. Ethan used this to his advantage. Softer soil meant quicker digging, but it also meant the trenches needed deeper foundations to hold against the next storm. He widened the main trench and carved 2 branching channels that angled sharply away from the fire. Each channel curved gently around the camp like the prongs of a protective crown. The squad watched in silence as he worked, as if each stroke of the shovel revealed another invisible rule of this strange moon. When the first branch was complete, Ethan paused to catch his breath and shield his eyes from the harshening light. The wind had shifted again, carrying a faint chemical scent from distant mineral deposits. That scent always preceded weather changes. He needed to finish before the atmosphere turned hostile. He resumed digging with renewed urgency. The ground sloped slightly on the eastern side of the plateau, so he carved deeper trenches there to accommodate the natural flow of water. Gravity would do half the work for them during storms, but only if the trenches guided the flow instead of fighting it. He pressed the shovel blade along the edges, smoothing them into precise curves that funneled water efficiently. Each curve mattered, each angle mattered, and each decision built on instinct, honed through years of reading terrain far more forgiving than this moon. A slim, scaled cadet approached with hesitation and pointed out that the trenches resembled ancient irrigation systems used on her homeworld. Ethan nodded. He didn't need to explain that survival often mirrored agriculture. Water moved the same way whether one intended to grow crops or avoid drowning. She watched him closely, absorbing the logic behind every movement. For the first time, he felt the squad beginning to shift from passive observers to potential partners. He carved another channel, deeper than the previous ones, designed specifically to catch the first wave of storm water before it could reach the fire. This one sloped downward and connected with the main trench at a precise angle that would accelerate the flow outward. When he tested the depth with his boot, the soil held firm. That was when the winds changed again, sharper, colder, carrying tiny grains of dust that pricked at exposed skin. A storm was forming sooner than expected. Ethan quickened his pace. He dug smaller trenches between the main paths, creating a lattice that would disperse any overflow. He shaped raised soil ridges along the outer edge of the camp, compacting them until they resembled low, crude walls. A Yavaran cadet finally joined him, mimicking his movements even though she lacked the strength to match the depth of his cuts. Ethan adjusted her grip on the shovel when she faltered and showed her how to leverage her body weight instead of relying on upper limb strength. Soon, a second alien stepped in to help, then a third. Within minutes, the once skeptical squad was digging beside him, shaping the ground with unfamiliar enthusiasm. He didn't need to command them. The urgency of the approaching winds did that for him. By midday, the trenches stretched around the camp in an intricate network of channels, basins, and reinforced ridges. Ethan inspected each section carefully, pressing his heel into the soil to test stability. When he reached the eastern branch, he spotted a weak point where water could potentially breach the wall. He dropped to one knee and scooped a large clump of damp soil with his bare hands, packing it firmly into the gap. His palms stung from the cold, but he continued until the wall held firm. He stood, dusted his hands on his trousers, and surveyed the entire formation with a slow, approving nod. The first gust of storm wind slammed across the plateau like a warning roar. Dust spiraled upward and drifted into the trenches, but the channels held their shape. A faint rumble echoed from the horizon, distant thunder, or perhaps the beginning of the rain cycle. Ethan knew the storm would hit soon. The squad gathered behind him, watching the sky darken. Some looked afraid. Others looked ready to face whatever came. He stood at the center of the camp and scanned the trenches one last time. Everything was aligned. Everything was ready. When the first drops of freezing rain finally struck the plateau, the trenches carried the water outward exactly as intended. Not a single line collapsed. The camp remained dry. And for the first time, every alien cadet understood that Ethan wasn't just digging holes. He was reshaping the moon itself into something that obeyed survival rather than chaos. The storm had passed by the time the pale sun of Orvellis 3 crept above the horizon, leaving behind a landscape washed clean by freezing rain. The ground shimmered faintly where thin layers of ice clung to exposed ridges, and the trenches Ethan had carved glistened like silver threads etched into the soil. The air held a sharp, brittle chill that stiffened fingers and stung cheeks, but the camp remained intact. Ethan rose from his sleeping place while the others dozed lightly near the still warm embers of the night fire. He didn't speak or stretch or seek comfort. Instead, he scanned the plateau with a long, calculating stare. Water had drained exactly as he planned, but the storm had revealed something even more valuable to him: how the soil behaved under pressure. He walked toward the eastern trench where the runoff had been strongest. The storm water had dug a thin gash in the surrounding dirt before entering the trench, exposing darker layers beneath. Ethan knelt beside the gash and pressed his fingers into the damp soil. It held its shape, compressing into a firm, cool mass that reminded him of clay. He rolled a small piece between his fingers. The consistency was perfect for insulation. He looked up toward the plateau's natural slope, then toward the sheltered corner tucked behind a low ridge. Every element of the terrain seemed to align with the idea forming in his mind. If he could dig deeper, far deeper than before, he could create an underground space shielded from storms, wind, and temperature swings. A place where supplies would last longer than a few hours. A place where the squad could work, rest, and even cook with stability. He retrieved the shovel and walked toward the ridge. The ground there dipped gently, and the soil carried residual moisture from repeated storm exposure. That moisture would make the first cuts easier. He planted the shovel blade firmly and began digging with slow, deliberate strokes. The upper layer crumbled easily, revealing the denser clay-like material beneath. He carved a rectangular outline first, widening it gradually as he went. When the hole reached knee depth, he stepped inside and felt the difference immediately. The cold wind no longer struck him directly. The air was heavier, warmer, protected by the earthen walls. He dug deeper, each movement of the shovel echoing faintly within the growing pit. One alien cadet approached him, wrapped tightly in her thermal cloth. She watched him work for several minutes before asking whether he intended to build a shelter. Ethan didn't stop digging. Instead, he said that the camp needed a storage space insulated from the violent temperature swings. Food spoiled quickly when exposed to the cold nights and scorching midday heat. If they wanted to keep rations safe for the next stages of the survival exam, storing them underground was the only logical approach. The cadet blinked, surprised that he thought about food preservation rather than personal comfort. Ethan didn't bother explaining that comfort without calories meant nothing. He kept digging, deepening the pit until the walls reached his chest. With each layer he removed, the soil grew cooler and denser. He checked for signs of groundwater but found none, which meant the pit could remain dry as long as the trenches stayed functional. Once the cavity reached shoulder depth, he shaped steps into one side of the opening, carving them with angled strokes of the shovel. The steps allowed easy entry and exit without forcing anyone to climb precariously. When he finally stepped back onto the surface, his clothes were streaked with dirt, and his palms throbbed slightly from gripping the shovel. But his eyes carried the unmistakable spark of a clear and evolving plan. He began refining the structure, pressing fistfuls of damp soil against the pit walls to reinforce them. The clay-like material bonded tightly, forming smooth surfaces that resisted collapse. He sculpted a higher section of the interior into a shelf-like platform, packing the soil until it became firm enough to support weight. This elevated platform would hold the ration packs, keeping them dry even if minor water seepage occurred during future storms. He continued shaping the storage pit with a precision that made it resemble a small underground chamber rather than a crude hole. Once the basic shape was complete, Ethan moved a short distance uphill and began carving a narrow drainage channel that sloped toward the pit, but stopped just before reaching it. He explained to the observing cadet that the channel would not feed water into the pit, but would instead serve as a temperature regulator. Cool air from the ridge would settle into the channel and lower the pit's internal temperature without introducing moisture. By controlling the airflow, the pit could act like a primitive cellar, preserving food through simple thermal stability. The cadet nodded in awe, realizing he wasn't just digging instinctively. He was engineering an entire survival infrastructure one element at a time. As the pit took shape, other cadets emerged from their resting places and gathered around. Some offered to help, though their species-specific physiology sometimes proved clumsy with the shovel. Ethan handed them small tasks that didn't require precision, clearing loose dirt, packing sidewalls, carrying compact soil clumps. The collaborative momentum grew naturally, as if the pit itself pulled them into a shared purpose. Even the Iveran cadet who had previously questioned every decision began helping by reinforcing the rim with heavy stones. Once the storage pit was fully formed, Ethan evaluated the surrounding terrain again. The ridge provided natural shade during the hottest part of the day, but it also offered something far more valuable: wind shielding. He stepped into the shadow of the ridge and pressed his palm against the soil. The texture was firmer here, enriched by mineral content. That firmness meant he could carve another structure into it, something more ambitious than the pit. He envisioned a shallow alcove carved directly into the ridge wall, a place where heat from the fire could be harnessed and redirected into a controlled workspace. He raised the shovel again and began cutting into the ridge's slope. The soil resisted at first, but once he breached the upper crust, the interior layers crumbled softly into workable masses. He carved a concave cavity just large enough for a person to crouch inside. The shape resembled a half-buried dome, its ceiling supported by a natural curve that distributed weight evenly across the surface. As he worked deeper, cooler air collected inside the cavity, demonstrating its insulating potential. Once the alcove reached a suitable depth, he stepped inside and observed how sound behaved within it. The curvature dampened outside noise, creating a quiet pocket sheltered from wind. Perfect for meal preparation. Perfect for any future work requiring concentration. Satisfied, he shaped a narrow vent near the top of the alcove, angled upward and outward toward the sky. This vent would allow smoke to escape once he converted the alcove into a functional kitchen workspace. Another cadet approached and asked whether he intended to turn the alcove into a shelter. Ethan shook his head and pointed toward the fire. The alcove was too small for sleeping, but ideal for protection while working. Food preparation in storms required controlled environments, and the ridge's structure offered exactly that. As the day warmed significantly, the underground pit cooled steadily, demonstrating its effectiveness. Cadets lowered their rations inside and were astonished at how quickly the cellar stabilized in temperature. Ethan checked the structure one last time, climbing the steps smoothly and emerging with a faint smile. The camp now had a protected space for food, a safe working alcove, and a network of trenches that turned stormwater into an obedient force rather than a threat. The squad watched him as he wiped dirt from his hands and lifted the shovel onto his shoulder. None of them doubted what he planned next. He would build more. He would carve more. He would shape this barren moon into something livable. And as long as he continued, the camp stood a chance not just to survive, but to thrive. Ethan stood at the ridge's shadowed edge with the shovel resting against his shoulder, his gaze fixed on the alcove he had carved earlier. The underground storage pit now held all remaining food, protected from both heat and frost. The trenches formed a defensive web around the camp. Everything he had built worked exactly as intended, but he knew the instructors would soon evaluate the squads. The last phase of the survival exam always required a demonstration, not of endurance, but of skill. Each team had to prepare a meal without technological assistance. The others would doubtless attempt crude roasting or risky open-flame cooking. Ethan intended something entirely different, something that would change how the examiners viewed the resourcefulness of his team, and, if he was honest, how the alien cadets viewed him. He knelt near the alcove and examined the floor, scraping off loose soil until he reached a compact layer underneath. He tapped the surface with the shovel's handle and listened to the muted thump that echoed faintly around the curved walls. The resonance told him everything he needed to know. The ground was stable enough to support heat without collapsing. The alcove would become the heart of a true earth stove kitchen, not a makeshift fire pit, not a primitive oven, but a functional cooking chamber powered solely by heat distribution and airflow control. He began by deepening the alcove's floor, carving out a half-meter depression that widened toward the back and narrowed near the opening. He shaped the bottom into a smooth bowl that would concentrate heat. Then he lifted the shovel and began carving 2 parallel channels along the alcove floor, guiding them toward a small exit vent he had positioned earlier. These channels would allow smoke to escape upward while keeping the cooking area relatively clear. As he worked, his hands grew coated with cold dust, which clung to his fingers despite repeated attempts to brush it off. He ignored the discomfort. Precision mattered more than cleanliness now. One cadet approached him, holding a bundle of dry sticks gathered from the nearby ridge. She asked whether he wanted them for the fire. Ethan shook his head and pointed instead to the shallow slope outside the alcove. He instructed her to lay the sticks there for later use. He wasn't building a typical fire pit. He needed a multi-chamber system capable of controlling heat in stages. Heat too strong would burn their limited food, and heat too weak would leave it partially raw. In the environment of Orvellis 3, balance was everything. He dug an adjoining side chamber on the left wall, forming a pocket just large enough to hold small stones. He intended to heat the stones separately and then transfer them into this chamber, where they would radiate long, steady warmth. On the opposite wall, he carved a narrow tunnel that connected the main bowl to a secondary heating pocket. This pocket would serve as a concentrated hotspot when needed. The alcove now resembled a miniature system of interconnected cooking rooms, each designed with purpose. After finishing the earthwork, Ethan stood and stretched his stiff back. The cadets gathered around him, curiosity replacing their earlier skepticism. He explained nothing. He picked up the shovel and walked to the fire pit, scooping glowing embers into a small clay-lined bucket he had fashioned earlier, using compacted soil. He carried the embers carefully into the alcove and placed them in the main chamber, arranging them in a small mound at the bowl's base. Warmth instantly began to spread across the newly carved floor. He then returned to the fire pit and selected several stones, ones he had chosen the previous day for their density and smoothness. He placed the stones into the embers at the alcove's entrance, allowing them to heat slowly. With the fire established, Ethan gathered the ration packs from the underground pit. He opened each one and separated the ingredients, laying them on the smooth shelf inside the alcove. The rations were simple: protein blocks, dried vegetables, compressed grain sheets. Most squads would simply rehydrate them and apply direct heat, resulting in a soggy or burnt mixture. Ethan intended something far better. He arranged the dried vegetables inside the heated side chamber, allowing them to soften gradually as moisture from the air combined with the radiated heat. The protein blocks he placed above the heated stones, letting them warm evenly from below. The grain sheets he set near the entrance of the alcove, where gentle drafts from outside kept them from drying out too quickly. As the heating process continued, the alcove filled with an aroma none of the cadets had expected. The warmth deepened the sense of the ingredients, blending them into something rich and comforting. The aliens drew closer, their expressions shifting from simple curiosity to disbelief. One of them asked him whether humans always cooked like this. Ethan smiled faintly and said that humans cooked however circumstances demanded. If he had a kitchen made of steel, he would use steel. If he had a kitchen carved from dirt and air, he would use that instead. He tended the embers carefully, occasionally shifting them to regulate temperature. The bowl-shaped chamber allowed heat to rise evenly, surrounding the food rather than scorching it. The airflow channels carried smoke upward, and the alcove remained surprisingly clear. After a long period of monitoring and adjusting, Ethan decided the meal was ready. He removed the grain sheets first, which had absorbed enough warmth to soften but still held their structure. Next, he retrieved the protein blocks, now tender and fragrant. Finally, he removed the vegetables, which had transformed into something far more appetizing than their dehydrated form. He arranged the meal on a flat stone slab, creating a dish that looked nothing like standard survival rations. The cadets stared at the portioned layers, marveling at the textures and colors. One asked whether this counted as cheating. Ethan answered calmly that he had followed every rule of the exam. He had used no tools beyond the shovel and no ingredients beyond the issued rations. He had simply applied the knowledge he carried within him. The moment he stepped outside the alcove with the finished meal, a trio of instructors approached the camp. Their stern expressions softened when they caught the aroma drifting from the stone slab. One instructor asked which squad had prepared the dish. The cadets pointed to Ethan. Another instructor inspected the earth stove kitchen inside the ridge. His expression shifted from disbelief to stunned admiration. He traced the airflow vent with his fingers, examined the heating pockets, and knelt to inspect the main chamber. When he emerged, he announced quietly that he had never seen such a system on Orvellis 3 in all his years overseeing the exam. Ethan stepped aside as the instructors sampled the food. Their silence spoke louder than praise. The dish was warm, balanced, tender, and filled with flavor, qualities impossible to achieve with crude open-fire cooking. One instructor finally asked Ethan where he had learned to build something like this. Ethan shrugged lightly and said that necessity had always been humanity's greatest teacher. Sometimes all a person needed was dirt, wind, and the will to shape both. The instructors conferred briefly, then declared Ethan's squad the highest-performing team in the exam's history. The announcement spread quickly, stirring cheers among the cadets. Ethan didn't raise his voice or celebrate loudly. He simply rested the shovel against the alcove wall and looked over the camp he had shaped with nothing but determination and the simplest tool. The trenches, the cellar, the alcove, and the earth stove kitchen together formed a living testament to what one mind and one pair of hands could create under pressure. As the squad prepared to depart Orvellis 3, Ethan lingered for a moment, studying the structures one last time. The moon would erase his work eventually. Wind would smooth the walls. Frost would soften the edges. Storms would fill the trenches. But the knowledge he had demonstrated would remain with the cadets who had watched him, changing how they viewed survival and how they viewed humans. He lifted the shovel, feeling its familiar weight, and walked toward the shuttle with a rare sense of quiet pride. The exam had not tested how much he could endure. It had tested how much he could create, and he had built something lasting, even in a place incapable of keeping it.